The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was unusually quiet that morning, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the press gallery shoulder to shoulder, their laptops already open, their fingers eager to fire off the live tweets and breaking updates this hearing almost always promised. Onlookers, both political staffers and members of the public who had lined up since before sunrise, craned their necks expectantly. The atmosphere was not unlike waiting for a heavyweight prize fight to begin. Everyone already knew who was expected to dominate and who was expected to be overmatched. At the center of it all sat Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, the well-practiced architect of countless high-profile clashes. He had become such a fixture of these hearings that some joked C-SPAN should add a Jim Jordan questioning cam as a regular feature. Dressed, as always, in his signature mismatched professional casual style, a crisp white shirt with sleeves rolled dangerously close to his elbows, and that trademark yellow tie hanging slightly askew, Jordan looked every bit the seasoned brawler. His body language radiated the confidence of a man expecting victory before the bell had even rung. For more than a decade, he had honed his reputation here, aggressive, relentless, and always ready to parry any response with yet another rapid-fire question. By contrast, at the far end of the semicircle, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, looking almost out of place in the hum of pre-hearing chatter. No easy grin, no huddles with a swarm of staffers, no restless scrolling through a phone. Instead, she was hunched forward over a fat binder, organized with sticky notes and legal tabs like multicolored strategic markers on a battlefield map. A cup of coffee sat untouched at her side, long since gone cold. Her dark eyes scanned page after page, every statute highlighted, every PR accident underlined as if she were preparing for trial. Indeed, in her mind, that was exactly what this was. Jordan's camp had predicted the day with near mathematical certainty. The chairman would scorch the Attorney General's representative with lines honed in weeks of preparation. The conservative press would gush over his defense of ordinary Americans under siege, and Jordan himself would ride the momentum into prime-time interviews scheduled later that very evening. It was not hubris, but habit. Time and again, the formula had worked. Jordan's words were rarely dissected too closely because they sounded authoritative, delivered with such unwavering confidence that few outside bona fide legal circles bothered to check them. This congressional morning was supposed to follow that same script. The outcome, everyone thought, was predetermined, but Jasmine Crockett had shown up with a different story in mind, one painstakingly crafted in the dim light of early mornings and late nights in her office. She wasn't here to win a soundbite or make a guest appearance on cable. She was here because she believed what too many others had overlooked, that accuracy matters. Jordan had the crowd, the clout, and the cameras. She had something rarer, facts that could withstand scrutiny. The silence in the chamber stretched as the chairman shuffled his notes, ready to launch into his opening diatribe. No one sensed, not yet, that the spell of inevitability hanging over the room was about to break. The storm had not started, but the air already crackled with the electricity of something extraordinary about to unfold. Every great showdown is defined by its opponents. In sports, in history, and certainly in politics, the drama intensifies when the characters on opposite sides couldn't be more different. On paper, Jim Jordan and Jasmine Crockett belonged to the same institution, members of the United States House of Representatives, but beyond that thin similarity, they might as well have come from different worlds. Jordan was, by now, a household name to anyone who watched even a sliver of cable news. Elected to Congress back in 2007, he carried with him the ethos of a wrestling coach, which, fittingly, was his profession before politics. His congressional persona retained that edge, the forward-leaning, badger-the-opponent posture of someone used to grappling until the other side collapsed. His reputation was built less on crafting intricate legislation and more on dominating hearings, producing viral clips for the conservative base, and weaponizing sheer confidence as if it were its own evidence. There was a power in his style. He rarely relied on written notes, instead rattling off fragments of Supreme Court cases, statutory language, and constitutional provisions as if they were instinctively second nature. To the average listener, this was stunning. How could someone recite laws so fluently unless he truly mastered them? That was the brilliance of Jordan's act. He sounded like authority incarnate. In America's age of sound bites, that was usually enough. What fewer people knew or bothered to ask was what lay behind the curtain. Jordan did have a law degree from Capital University Law School, but he had never once taken the bar. Unlike courtroom attorneys, he never argued in front of a judge, never cross-examined a witness, never bore the consequences of being wrong in an actual case. He lived in a bubble where words were weapons, but the accuracy of those words often went unchecked. Tidit. And in that void, he had flourished for nearly 2 decades. Enter Jasmine Crockett, his polar opposite in pedigree and style. At 38, she was brand new to Congress, barely into her first term. To her critics, that made her expendable, easily brushed aside. But before taking the oath of office, she had spent over a decade practicing civil rights law in Texas. Not glamorous work, but grueling real-world combat in dusty courthouses and tense trials. Unlike Jordan, Crockett couldn't afford to get citations wrong. Mistakes in her work could bankrupt a client, or worse, land them in prison. She had sharpened her skills in front of judges who cut no slack, against opponents who showed no mercy. While Jordan leaned on performance, Crockett leaned on precision. She had the receipts, not in the metaphorical sense politicians love to toss around, but actual printed statutes and precedents with neon tabs sticking out of them like battle flags. Her background in the courtroom made her allergic to sloppy legal arguments. She had a simple rule drilled into her from day one of practice. You cite it, you better be able to prove it. Jordan, at 60, had longevity. Crockett, at 38, had freshness. He thrived on noise. She thrived on silence, the kind of silence where every word you dropped had the weight of truth behind it. He was preparing to once more dominate through sheer force of personality. She was preparing, quietly, rigorously, to puncture that balloon of bluster with actual law. This wasn't merely a clash of 2 lawmakers. It was something rarer, political theater about to collide head-on with legal precision. One man had perfected the art of sounding right. One woman had spent her career making sure she was right. When such opposites meet, someone's foundation will inevitably crumble. On this morning, that someone wasn't the one looking absorbed in her binder at the far end. But of the dais, it was the man at the center, still unaware that his greatest foil had arrived. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Jim Jordan reached for the gavel. He struck the block with practiced force, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber like the opening cymbal crash of a familiar overture. Heads turned instantly toward the center dais. The performance was beginning, and Jordan knew his role better than anyone else in the room. He adjusted his yellow tie and leaned forward, speaking in that clipped Ohio cadence endlessly familiar to reporters who had covered him for years. His body language was aggressive from the very start. Elbows planted, torso tilted as if he were ready to spring across the table itself. His voice rose with the rhythm of righteous indignation, a preacher in mid-sermon about corruption, weaponization, and constitutional betrayal. "We are here today," he thundered, "to examine one of the most dangerous trends in American history, the weaponization of our justice system against citizens simply for their beliefs." The opening line landed like a punch. Cameras zoomed in instantly, reporters' hands flying across keyboards. This was the Jordan they expected, the Jordan they came for. He flourished a stack of papers, props no one expected him to actually read from. He rarely needed them. Instead, he rattled off case names as if his memory were endless. Brandenburg, Carpenter, United States, v. Nixon. He sprinkled constitutional amendments like seasoning, the 1st, the 4th, the 5th, the 14th. To the untrained ear, it sounded like a law school lecture delivered from the pulpit. To his base, this was proof that their champion could out-argue anyone on the left. We're talking about violations of the First Amendment, free speech denied. We're talking about the Fourth Amendment, illegal searches and seizures, the Fifth, the right against self-incrimination, and the 14th, due process shredded before our very eyes. He paused strategically, for effect, letting the phrasing echo, each clause hammering home the narrative of a Justice Department gone rogue. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, Jordan commanded the room. His voice rushed like a waterfall of citations and declarations, peppered with just enough certainty to make every claim sound irrefutable. Members of his caucus nodded along. Conservative networks backstage must have been already queuing up his sound bites for the evening broadcasts. This was supposed to be another notch in Jordan's belt, another viral victory. But the camera did not catch everything. At the far end of the dais, Jasmine Crockett was silent and still, pen scratching furiously against her notepad. Each time Jordan cited an amendment, she circled it. Each time he invoked a statute or case, she made a notation and flipped open the binder before her. Where Jordan spoke of the law as though it were clay for his rhetoric, Crockett was cross-referencing the actual text. Line by line, claim by claim, she was quietly constructing the scaffolding of what was about to become his undoing. By the time Jordan triumphantly finished, his voice cracking with the conviction of a man certain the audience was in his corner, he sat back with visible satisfaction. To his supporters, it was vintage Jordan, fiery, fearless, irresistible. What he didn't notice was that in his flood of certainties, he had overstepped. He had misstated, miscited, even invented. For years, no one had called him on it. But Crockett, with her towering binder and steady calm, was preparing to do exactly that. The storm clouds were gathering, even if Jordan still believed it was a sunny day. The normal flow of a judiciary hearing is an old and predictable dance. The chairman blazes his opening statement, Democrats push back, Republicans thunder again, and so on in a ritual as scripted as professional wrestling. Everyone knew their steps, everyone knew their lines. But when Jasmine Crockett's microphone light blinked red, signaling her turn to speak, the choreography stopped. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice low and clear. No false drama, no fire for fire's sake. Just deliberate calm, a lawyer's calm. She reached for her binder, the one she'd been meticulously marking throughout Jordan's speech, and laid it flat on the desk before her, letting the thick stack of papers thud softly against the wood like a declaration. "I came prepared." She didn't even glance down at her notes. Instead, she looked directly at Jordan. "Before I begin my questions for the witness," she said, "I need to address some of the legal claims the chairman made in his opening remarks." The air in the room shifted. This wasn't the script. Members don't use their question time to interrogate the chairman himself. Jordan's eyebrows arched, his irritation instantly visible. He leaned toward his microphone, reminding her, "The gentle lady's time is for questions to the witness, not the chair." A familiar maneuver, an attempt to reassert dominance and steer her back into his playbook. "Oh, I'll get to the witness, Mr. Chairman," Crockett replied evenly. A flicker of a smile touched her lips. Not arrogance, but confidence. The kind of smile trial lawyers wear when they know they've laid the perfect trap. "But, as any good lawyer knows, you've got to establish the foundation first. We need to make sure we're working from accurate legal information." Reporters sat straighter. Fingers hovered above keyboards. This was no longer the rehearsal they expected. This was jazz, entirely on toes, scripted. She began with what sounded like a simple pop quiz, but it was more like a scalpel. "In your opening, you cited Brandenburg v. Ohio. Could you tell the committee what year that case was decided?" A shiver of recognition ran through the lawyers in the gallery. This was not grandstanding. This was cross-examination, the kind that builds slowly, trap by trap, until the witness sits ensnared. Jordan bristled. "The gentle lady's time," he began again, but she cut through him clean. "It was 1969, Mr. Chairman." "Correct. Now, could you tell us the actual holding of that case?" The air thinned. Staffers shifted in their seats. Members leaned forward. Suddenly, the dynamic had flipped. The man used to cornering others with rapid-fire questions was now the one on the line. When Jordan stumbled, adding and omitting key elements of the Brandenburg test, Crockett calmly read from the actual decision, word for word. The missing language was fatal. Jordan's version left out the likelihood requirement, the distinction between political speech and criminal incitement. To an ordinary audience, perhaps it was a quibble. To a room full of lawmakers, lawyers, and cameras, it was a wound. And she wasn't done. Her hands, steady and deliberate, began turning pages of the binder. Each tab was a matter Jordan had bungled in his bravado. Statutes misquoted, precedents misapplied, even mysteries like cases that didn't actually exist. This was not a 5-minute question period anymore. It was a cross-examination, and it was staged with a lawyer's flawless pacing. Jim Jordan had thrown his usual punch. Jasmine Crockett was showing she'd brought an arsenal of counterpunches sharpened over every tired, grueling hour of preparation. And for the first time that morning, the room realized this was not going to be Jim Jordan's show after all. What separates rhetoric from reality is evidence. Anyone can thunder about constitutional freedoms and liberty lost, but the moment actual documents hit the table, the conversation changes. Jasmine Crockett knew this. She had built her career around it. Fact by fact, case by case, client by client, evidence was always the difference between justice and injustice. And in that hearing room, she was about to prove that evidence could dismantle a career of bluster. Her binder snapped open with practiced ease. She slid a sheet forward deliberately, the way an attorney would mark an exhibit in trial. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone steady, "in your opening, you cited 18 U.S.C. 01512 as requiring the physical destruction of evidence. But please, show me where in the statute such language appears." Jordan adjusted in his seat, visibly unsettled. "Madam, this is not a law school exam." "No," Crockett cut in, voice still even but sharper now. "This is the Judiciary Committee. The law is precisely what we're supposed to be examining. If we accuse others of violating it, we had better quote it correctly. So, for the record." She lifted the paper so cameras could catch it. "The statute says, and I quote, 'Whoever corruptly obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding.' No mention of physical destruction. None. The law covers obstruction of proceedings, exactly what happened on January 6th. Words matter, Mr. Chairman." The room murmured. Reporters leaned forward like sprinters off the blocks. A Republican staffer in the corner scribbled furiously, while Jerry Nadler on the Democratic side leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a grin playing just behind his jowls. But Crockett was only warming up. She flipped again, a neon sticky tab guiding her to the next strike. "You also invoked United States v. Nixon as proof that executive privilege is absolute. But here, so what the opinion actually states," she read cleanly from the printed case text, "neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications, without more, can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege." Her eyes lifted to Jordan, holding him there. "The court said the exact opposite of what you claimed. That case toppled Nixon, Mr. Chairman. Yet today you tried to use it to build a wall he could have only dreamed of. Why?" Jordan's jaw tightened. His staffers thrust notes at him, but he ignored them, choosing instead to glare at his challenger. Crockett adjusted another tab and withdrew yet another sheet. "And then there's this. Your letter calling for this very hearing cited Thompson v. Louisiana for the sweeping claim that warrantless searches are categorically unconstitutional. I checked. Thompson v. Louisiana does not exist. There is a 1984 case, Louisiana v. Thompson, about jury instructions. There is a case about crime scenes, but no such case that does what you claimed. So my question is simple, Mr. Chairman. Did you invent it?" The silence was crushing. For one of the few times in his congressional career, Jim Jordan did not have a soundbite waiting in the chamber of his throat. The hearing room froze, except for the fast clicking of reporter keyboards, documenting the moment a freshman representative, armed with nothing more than receipts, had stripped away the aura of legal mastery Jordan had nurtured for nearly 2 decades. A wrestling coach once, a congressional brawler now, suddenly he looked less like a fighter and more like a man pinned firmly to the mat. Up until that moment, most observers assumed the hearing would follow its weary partisan script. Republicans lob accusations, Democrats defend the administration, the cable networks splice the best fireworks for prime time, and then everyone moves on. But once Jasmine Crockett dropped her stack of receipts, something subtle but seismic shifted. This wasn't partisan jousting anymore. It felt like a cross-examination unfolding before millions, one that Jordan had not prepared for and could not escape. The tension was palpable. Members who had been half distracted on their phones were suddenly riveted, eyes darting between Crockett's binder and Jordan's increasingly flushed face. The Republicans' side grew restless, whispering among themselves, crossing arms, staring daggers at the intruder who dared question their chairman's credibility. Meanwhile, Democrats abandoned their poker faces. Some allowed the faintest smiles to surface, as though they had just discovered an oasis after years in the desert. Jerry Nadler leaned forward intently, his lips twitching into something dangerously close to glee. The reporters caught it instantly. Laptops clattered like typewriters in overdrive. Thumbs fired tweets that flew into the digital ether. Within minutes, headlines began to form across social media platforms. Repral Crockett fact-checks Jordan in real time. Did Jim Jordan cite a case that doesn't exist? This is not going well for the chairman. The ripple was instantaneous, the narrative flipping while Jordan still sat captive at his dais. He tried, of course, to reclaim control. "The gentle lady," he bristled, his words clipped with anger, "is splitting hairs. She is deliberately twisting." But Crockett cut through effortlessly. "No, Mr. Chairman, I am quoting the law, directly, something the public deserves to hear the Judiciary Committee do." Her rebuttals weren't loud, but they were surgical. Where Jordan relied on volume, she relied on precision. Each time he blustered, she countered with text. Each time he bristled, she countered with calm paperwork. And the room could feel it. Momentum, once squarely on Jordan's side, was now slipping like sand between his fingers. Even Republican members looked uncomfortable. Matt Gaetz tried to interject on a point of order. Others whispered furiously to staffers, hunting in vain for citations to patch Jordan's holes. One GOP aide tugged nervously at his tie, muttering under his breath as if to will the clock to speed forward. Meanwhile, Crockett pressed on with rhythmic grace, never rushing, never stumbling. In that contrast, the flushed chairman, angry and defensive, versus the steady freshman calmly unfurling statute after statute, the optics became undeniable. The man who for years had relished humiliating witnesses was, for the first time, visibly humiliated himself. Outside the chamber, the internet devoured every morsel. The hashtag Crockett destroys. Jordan trended within the hour. Side-by-sides of Jordan's choking response and Crockett's calm delivery flooded Twitter. The clip of her debunking the Phantom Thompson versus Louisiana case spread like wildfire, garnering hundreds of thousands of views before the hearing had even adjourned. Conservative outlets scrambled to draft a defense, but nothing sticks well in the middle of a viral storm. Inside the room, the Democrats' confidence swelled, while Republicans grew restless in their chairs. People weren't just watching a misstep anymore, they were watching a reversal. The king of the committee was bleeding in the water, and the sharks, reporters, opponents, even quiet doubters, could sense it. For Jim Jordan, the tide wasn't just turning, it was already rushing out to sea, carrying his years of untouchable authority with it. By now, the hearing no longer resembled a committee exercise. It felt like a courtroom drama expanded for live television. The chairman's swagger had evaporated, replaced by clipped interruptions and flushed frustration. Jim Jordan, who had earned his reputation by setting traps for others, had wandered squarely into one, and the deeper he struggled, the more the trap tightened around him. Sensing his vulnerability, Crockett shifted gears. Up until now, she had simply corrected errors. Statutes misquoted, precedents twisted, cases invented. That alone would have been bad enough. But then she decided it was time to widen the scope. Time to make the room, and the nation, ask not just whether Jordan got this or that wrong, but whether he was ever qualified to be making these claims at all. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice calm but now carrying an edge of gravity, "you've presented yourself as a constitutional law expert for years. You've interrogated witnesses as though your interpretations carried weight equal to courts. But let's clarify something for the record." Jordan looked up sharply, suspicion flashing in his eyes. "You hold a law degree," Crockett continued firmly. "Capital University Law School, 2001, correct?" "Yes," Jordan answered, already defensive, "and I've served 17 years. "But you've never taken the bar exam, correct?" Crockett interrupted smoothly. She let the silence hang as Jordan stiffened. "That means you've never practiced law. You've never argued before a court. You've never represented a client whose freedom depended on your accuracy. Isn't that correct?" Jordan shifted in his chair, muttering something about it not being required for Congress. "No," Crockett replied, pouncing on his half-answer. "It's not. But it is required to practice law, and that's the point, Mr. Chairman. You've made legal declarations for years without any of the safeguards that come with practicing law. Judges correct lawyers. Opposing counsel keeps them honest. You've had none of that, and it shows." That landed like a thunderbolt. The gallery buzzed, reporters' fingers flew. To many watching, it was the first time someone had punctured Jordan's carefully inflated balloon of legal authority, not with politics, but with simple biography. Still not done, Crockett returned to her binder and pulled out a neatly folded document. She glanced at the chair before announcing its contents. "For the record, Mr. Chairman, I am submitting a formal complaint to the House Ethics Committee. Attached are 43 false or misleading statements about the law made by you in official committee hearings, letters, and public remarks. 16 statutes misquoted, 9 Supreme Court cases misstated, and 1, including today, completely fabricated citation to a case that does not exist." A stunned murmur rippled across the chamber. Even some on the Republican bench stared at Jordan with thinly veiled alarm. Filing an ethics complaint wasn't theater. It was a direct shot at the very integrity of the chairman's authority. Jordan's face burned crimson. He shuffled papers, waved his hand, tried to brush it all off as grandstanding. But his voice wavered. His gavel hand tightened around its handle, slamming down twice as if noise could drown accountability. Yet the symbolism was clear. When an aggressive questioner starts hammering the table instead of the witness, they're losing. Jordan was now fighting the optics of desperation. Meanwhile, Crockett stayed poised, still calm, still armed with documents, the gravity of her strategy only deepening. She had dragged the battle out of Jordan's preferred arena, angry rhetoric, and placed it squarely in hers, precision, ethics, and the integrity of law itself. In that arena, Jordan looked exposed, small even, a man whose armor had rusted long before anyone dared to test it. The gavel had barely touched wood for recess when the earthquake spread beyond the Judiciary Committee chamber. Inside, the drama still hung thick in the air. Republicans frantically huddling with staffers, Democrats suddenly fizzy with restrained smiles, reporters practically vibrating with adrenaline. But outside, in the world where perception becomes reality, the reckoning had already begun. On Twitter, clips of Crockett's takedowns proliferated at lightning speed. Journalists embedded in the chamber fired out play-by-plays that read like dispatches from a war front. Representative Crockett just forced Jordan to admit he cited a case that doesn't exist. Crockett reading the actual statute while Jordan glares is absolutely devastating. Within 10 minutes, the hashtag #CrockettDestroys Jordan was trending #1 in Washington, climbing nationally within the hour. Cable networks, caught off guard, scrambled to shift coverage. CNN cut into midday programming with a chyron that read, "Crockett fact-checks Jordan in real time." Over at MSNBC, anchors leaned forward with visible amazement, replaying the moment she brandished the phantom, Thompson v. Louisiana. Fox News, expecting to air Jordan's dominance, found themselves in a tailspin. Clips of Jordan stammering and slamming his gavel didn't exactly inspire confidence. Conservative influencers tried to control the damage. Some called it an ambush. Others sneered that a freshman was grandstanding for cameras. But those arguments collapsed almost immediately when scholars across the spectrum, left, right, center, tweeted the same refrain. She was accurate. Lawrence Tribe, the liberal lion of constitutional law, and Orrin Kerr, a prominent conservative legal analyst, both praised her precision. "This isn't a partisan moment," Kerr wrote. "It's a lawyer correcting years of sloppy legal rhetoric. In political spin wars, debate, partisan agreement is rarer than hen's teeth. Crockett had achieved it in under an hour." Meanwhile, memes sprouted like wildfire. A freeze frame of Jordan's bewildered face was overlaid with captions like, "When you realize the freshman actually went to law school." Another split screen showed Crockett calmly flipping through her binder opposite Jordan gripping his gavel, captioned, "Preparation versus Performance." By lunchtime, TikTok compilations were racking up millions of views. set to dramatic soundtracks that needed no embellishment. But the fallout wasn't limited to digital ridicule. In real-world corridors of power, donors and strategists began texting furiously. Jordan's reputation as the GOP's attack dog was a fundraising juggernaut, until he got shredded live. Within hours, whispers circulated that his war chest emails, usually reliable moneymakers after fiery hearings, were producing flat numbers. Nobody wants to invest in a prosecutor who just got humiliated in open court, one Republican operative privately confessed. Inside the chamber, the Democratic members smelled blood but kept their discipline. No gloating, no outbursts, just the quiet satisfaction of watching their newest colleague do what none of them had managed in 17 years. The Republicans, on the other hand, bore the strained expression of allies watching their champion suddenly stumble off script. The dawning recognition was clear. This wasn't just a bad hearing, it was a credibility crisis unraveling in real time. And Crockett herself? She sat back calmly, binder closed, her posture serene as though she had merely asked a few polite clarifications. But she must have known the effect. The story had already leapt beyond the walls of Congress. A hearing that was supposed to bolster Jim Jordan's authority had instead metastasized into the most watched political fact-check ambush in recent memory. For years, Jordan had been untouchable, a human soundbite machine who bludgeoned opponents with noise and momentum, but perception can curdle quickly. On this day, in under half an hour, the political ecosystem had rewritten his image. Not the confident interrogator, but the flustered chairman, dismantled before a live audience. Recess was only 15 minutes, but that was more than enough time for the story to escape gravity, and by the time Jordan banged his gavel again, the tide beyond the chamber had already turned decisively, irreversibly, against him. In Washington, most viral political moments fade as quickly as they flare. Yesterday's outrage, today's distraction, tomorrow's forgotten clip buried in the archives of the Internet. But what Jasmine Crockett did that day lodged itself into the DNA of the political and legal ecosystem. It wasn't just a takedown, it set a new expectation. Almost immediately, commentators started calling it the Crockett Standard. The phrase began humbly enough, coined by a law professor on Twitter, but it stuck. Pundits repeated it on cable shows, journalists invoked it in articles, even members of Congress whispered it in committee halls. What did it mean? Simply this: if you make a claim about the law in a public forum, it should hold up to scrutiny. No more bluffing with half-remembered statutes. No more sprinkling constitutional buzzwords into partisan speeches. If your words couldn't survive what Crockett had done, actual receipts, actual text, actual precedent, they fell short of the standard. Congress felt the tremors first. A bipartisan coalition, led quietly by moderates who'd watched Jordan's humiliation with growing unease, advanced a measure requiring all congressional committees to have access to nonpartisan legal counsel during hearings. Staff attorneys, trained, credentialed, and beholden to facts, were suddenly looped in to brief members before high-profile sessions. It was dubbed the Crockett Rule, and while Jordan's allies resisted it publicly, even they soon realized that an extra safety net could prevent their own reputations from suffering similar implosions. But the influence spread beyond Capitol Hill. Journalism adapted. Networks began hiring constitutional law analysts not just as occasional guests, but as permanent staff, available to fact-check in real time. Programs on both CNN and MSNBC launched recurring segments called Crockett Checks, where legal experts, RTS, compared politicians' claims against the black and white letter of the law. Even skeptical Fox anchors found themselves caveating political soundbites, adding, "Well, that may not meet the Crockett standard." Academia embraced it wholeheartedly. Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, and dozens of state law schools circulated Crockett's questioning as a teaching tool. First-year law students, once drilled primarily with the Socratic method, began watching the hearing footage to see how actual constitutional law could cut through political theater. Professors framed entire lectures around the lesson, bluster folds in the face of precision. And for Crockett herself, the change was dramatic. Overnight, the freshman Democrat transformed from relative anonymity into the committee's resident legal authority. When difficult statutory questions arose, colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, were suddenly asking, "What does Crockett think?" It wasn't partisan, it was practical. She was living proof that preparation could trump position. The broader cultural legacy, however, ran deeper. Her confrontation instilled something politics had been bleeding for years: accountability rooted in accuracy. "Does it meet the Crockett standard?" became a viral shorthand for honesty in public policy. It filtered down even into state legislatures and local councils. A politician citing a law loosely? Someone somewhere would challenge them. "Show me the receipts. Does that pass Crockett?" Jim Jordan, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. Once the quintessential Republican attack dog, he now bore the reputation of a man unraveled by facts. Conservative operatives quietly began coaching their own members better, urging them, "Don't end up like Jordan. Check your citations." The Crockett moment wasn't just a personal victory. It was a cultural inflection point. For the first time in years, accuracy had gone viral. Legal precision had upstaged performance, and Americans, lawyers, professors, students, even ordinary citizens, had cheered not just the spectacle, but the truth shining through it. Every political drama eventually fades into the relentless tide of new headlines, but not every moment leaves a mark. The clash between Jim Jordan and Jasmine Crockett was one of those rare episodes that etched itself into the permanent record, not just because of the political spectacle, but because it reaffirmed something basic. Truth still matters when someone is brave enough to defend it. For Jordan, the downfall was as stunning as it was instructive. For 17 years, he had earned a reputation as the GOP's attack dog, an unstoppable force barreling through hearings with rapid-fire accusations and confident assertions of law. The problem was simple and devastating. When finally tested, those assertions collapsed. He had played lawyer in televised hearings, but had never stood trial in a courtroom, never felt the pressure of a judge's gavel correcting a misstep, never answered to a rule book stricter than cable news talking points. When Crockett arrived, armed with the very real tools of practice, discipline, and accuracy, his thin armor cracked. That gavel he once swung like a hammer of authority came to symbolize desperation, pounding louder as his credibility slipped away. For Crockett, the episode became transformational. Overnight, she went from freshman backbencher to the committee's fiercest guardian of legal fidelity. But she resisted the temptation to bask in viral fame. In interviews afterward, she reminded viewers over and over that her confrontation wasn't about scoring points, it was about setting the record straight. As she put it, "The law doesn't care about whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It just is. And if we're going to have any real debates in this country, we need to start with truth, not fiction." It was a civics lesson America didn't expect, delivered with the poise of someone who had spent years fighting for clients who couldn't afford rhetorical luxuries. The long-term impact was undeniable. Politicians learned to tread more carefully when citing statutes and precedents. Committees began leaning more heavily on legal counsel. Reporters and fact-checkers brought real expertise into coverage instead of letting claims go unchecked. And a younger generation of law students and civic-minded voters absorbed the most important moral of the story: out-preparing bluster beats, outperforming it. Even Jordan, in an uncharacteristically candid moment years later, conceded, "Confidence isn't a substitute for knowledge." It was as close to an admission as he'd ever give, an acknowledgement that bravado can carve out airtime but not legitimacy. His star never recovered, but his stumble became a cautionary tale told to every freshman congressman with dreams of becoming a viral gladiator. And yet, the most enduring part of this story wasn't Jordan's fall, but Crockett's example. She showed that truth, when armed with preparation, isn't fragile. That democracy is healthiest when facts win the fight. That courage sometimes looks like a woman with a binder full of statutes quietly raising her hand and saying, "Actually, that's not what the law says." The lasting lesson of that day isn't about humiliation or triumph, it's about responsibility. Leaders owe their constituents the truth. Citizens owe one another the diligence to fact-check, to challenge nonsense, to demand higher standards. The Crockett moment reminded the country of a deceptively simple creed. In a world oversaturated with confident fictions, the one who brings uncomfortable facts changes everything. Because in the end, democracy doesn't survive on volume, it survives on veracity. And the day Jasmine Crockett fact-checked Jim Jordan into history, she proved that preparation and truth aren't just powerful weapons, they're the bedrock of accountable government.